So think about this for a second. Would you live in a rent-free apartment with gorgeous view of Mount St. Helens, plus like $100 a month in your pocket?
Okay, wait, what's the catch?
Well, the catch is that it's directly above an active funeral home.
Yeah, I mean, most of us would definitely run the other way.
Right, I know I would. But the author of the unpublished travel journals we're doing a deep dive into today, he actually said yes.
And that single decision basically triggered this lifelong globe-spanning obsession with how human beings process the end of life.
Exactly. So today, we are opening up these personal journals to really explore the wildly different ways cultures interact with death.
That's a fascinating journey.
It really is. We are taking you from the completely sanitized funeral parlors of the United States all the way to the raw, visceral traditions of Bangladesh, Indonesia, Papua, and Namibia.
We want to discover how the dead actually shape the communities of the living. And, it's a remarkable set of sources.
Yeah, especially because the author isn't approaching this as like an academic in a white coat.
Right, he's not a researcher. He just stumbles into these situations.
Yeah.
And it all begins with that apartment in Washington State.
So he takes the deal. Free rent, great view, $100 a month. But the trade-off is he has to take the night shift.
Which means answering dispatch calls for the undertaker downstairs. And this setting immediately establishes the baseline of how we in the West handle death.
Yeah, he describes the two undertakers who run the place as human-sized wax figures.
That's such a creepy image.
It really is. He says they wear black, their skin is super sallow, and they have absolutely no facial expressions.
And doesn't he mention their laugh?
Oh, yeah. He notes that when they laugh, it sounds like a tape recorder with a low battery. Just this mechanical ha-ha-ha where their lips barely even move.
It sounds so deeply unnerving.
Totally. And he actually clashes with them pretty quickly, too, because, well, he decides to turn his spare room into this massive neon UFO light show.
Right, like of all the things to do above a funeral home.
I know. He springs up all these glowing, flashing letters. From the street, it literally looks like a retro alien spacecraft has landed on his coffee table.
And the wax figure undertakers were not happy about that, I assume.
Oh, they immediately march upstairs and force him to tear it down. They'd argue it disrupts the somber nature of their business.
Which, honestly, perfectly illustrates the Western mandate, right? Death must be aggressively invisible.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we treat death like the behind the scenes of a theater production.
Yeah, the business of dying is meant to be completely unobtrusive, hidden behind drawn curtains, quiet voices.
And definitely an utter lack of neon lights. We only want to see the final polished show, the deceased in a nice suit, the careful makeup, the soft lighting.
We do not want to see the scaffolding or the ropes or the sweat of the stagehands. The community just isn't supposed to know what's happening.
Right. But by living in this apartment, the author gets dragged violently backstage.
He really does.
He has to stay up all night dispatching the coroner and the ambulance. And then we get to this one specific breaking point night.
Yeah, a night where the phone simply does not stop ringing. There are 6 deaths in a single night in this normally quiet area.
Which is incredibly unusual.
Right. And the younger undertaker, who usually maintains that completely detached professional facade, calls the author upstairs.
And he's practically begging for physical help.
He tells him, I can do the embalming, but they are too heavy. I cannot lift them onto the tables alone.
So the author walks downstairs, steps into this sterile, chemical-smelling room, and it is just filled with dead bodies.
He has to physically grab them, feel their dead weight, and heave them onto the metal operating tables.
It is an incredibly raw sensory overload. But the strange thing he writes in his journal is that by the end of that agonizing night, his fear was entirely gone.
The mechanism behind that psychological shift is so fascinating.
Yeah.
What's happening here is that abstract fear, the kind of fear that breeds in silence and hidden spaces, is terrifying because it's boundless.
Your imagination just makes it infinitely worse.
Exactly. But by facing the intense, grueling physical reality of lifting 6 bodies, he grounds himself.
By actually feeling their weight and engaging his own muscles to help another human being.
Right. The author's abstract terror is replaced by a grounded physical reality. It demystified the taboo.
So giving death a face, a weight, and a physical space turned it from a shadowy monster into, like, a calming familiarity.
It completely reframes how we think about exposure to things that scare us.
It really does. And just as a wild historical footnote, he actually moved out of that apartment just a month before Mount St. Helens erupted.
Talk about timing. He dodged a literal volcanic explosion.
Seriously. But this realization he has that physical proximity to death cures the fear of it sets up the rest of his travels perfectly.
Because if touching death in a sterile room in Washington state removes the fear, what happens when a culture brings death in the physical body out into the open streets?
Which is exactly what we find out when the journals jump to Dhaka, Bangladesh.
Right, during the Eid al-Adha festival. This is the global observance commemorating Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son.
And the author happens to be staying in a very wealthy urban neighborhood. Suddenly, these massive, elaborate canopies are erected right in the middle of the paved streets.
Dozens of huge bulls are brought in, just standing there among the houses and cars.
And then the ritual slaughter begins, right there on the cobblestones. The sensory whiplash here is extreme.
Oh, absolutely.
He describes the screaming of the animals, the intense smell, the blood pooling and spraying on the street.
To a Westerner accustomed to those silent wax figure undertakers, this just looks like pure chaos. It's a massive sensory shock.
But it's not chaos, is it?
No, not at all. It looks like chaos, but it's actually a highly orchestrated, vital social mechanism. The crucial detail is what happens to the meat after the slaughter.
Right. It is meticulously butchered and divided into strict thirds.
Exactly. 1/3 is kept for the family, 1/3 is distributed to friends and neighbors, and the final, most vital third is given directly to the poor.
Think about the last funeral or death-related event you attended here in the U.S. It likely cost the grieving family thousands of dollars, completely draining their resources.
Yeah, it's a massive financial burden.
But here, the presence of death is flipped into this incredible act of charity and wealth redistribution.
People in the city who haven't been able to afford meat all year are fed because of this localized bloody sacrifice.
And the efficiency of this community integration is staggering. The author notes that by the very next morning, those bloody cobblestones are spotless.
Not a drop of blood remains, not a single fly is buzzing around. The community absorbs the shock, processes the event, distributes the resources, and just cleans the slate overnight.
But you know, if Dhaka was a sensory shock regarding animal sacrifice, his experience in Sumba, Indonesia, pushes the human element to an absolute extreme.
Oh, the traditional funeral in Sumba.
Yeah. He is traveling through Sumba and literally stumbles into this rare, highly traditional funeral because a young girl who is weaving textiles invites him inside.
And when he walks into the house, the deceased uncle is just sitting there in the room with them.
He has been sitting in a bamboo chair for 3 days.
Because they are dealing with the harsh elements, the family has wrapped the chair and the uncle's body in thick construction plastic.
And they sealed the entire thing with massive amounts of modern duct tape. It's this surreal collision of ancient ritual and hardware store supplies.
In 50 degrees Celsius heat, no less.
Which is, what, 122 degrees Fahrenheit? The author writes that the smell of the decaying body isn't just a scent, it is a physical wall of odor that hits you in the chest.
And outside the house, the community is slaughtering buffaloes and pigs.
Right, because the belief is that the animal spirits are required to carry the uncle's soul to the afterlife.
So it is this overwhelming cacophony of crying, laughing, drumming, animal screams, and that unbearable heat.
I have to pause here, though. Imagine standing in that heat, with that overpowering smell and the chaotic noise. How does a community process that much intense stimuli without deeply traumatizing themselves?
It is a totally valid question, especially from our Western framework. But to the people of Sumba, this isn't trauma. It is highly structured sensory grounding.
Sensory grounding.
Yeah. In the West, we sanitize death to the point of sensory deprivation. Silence, stillness, chemical odors. We try to pretend it isn't happening.
Right, the wax figure undertakers again.
Exactly.
Okay.
But in Sumba, the overwhelming smell, the deafening noise, the communal sharing of the meat, it forces the community to be entirely present in the reality of mortality.
The dead aren't gone. They are waiting in the chair.
And eventually, the community believes the spirits go up to wait in the massive, towering roofs of the local houses. They call them the Uma Umbatangu.
And the taller the roof, the more ancestor spirits are living inside it. They are literally living under the protection of their dead.
And the physical burial is just as intense. They take the uncle, still in his duct-tape chair, and shove him into a ton-heavy megalithic stone tomb.
They seal the edges with wet cow dung to keep the elements out. And just before the final stone is placed, a woman tosses in a woven bag of betel nuts for him to chew in the afterlife.
Notice the transition here, though. We've moved from refusing to let the body leave the room in Indonesia to refusing to let the dead leave the family structure entirely.
Which naturally extends into the journal's exploration of Papua and Sulawesi.
Right, where we see the astonishing, sometimes agonizing lengths humans will go to physically manifest their grief and preserve their ancestors.
The story from Papua really stopped me in my tracks. The author is spending time learning about the Dani tribe, and he hears the story of a local man named Yeskil.
Yeskil has an 8-year-old son who falls terribly ill.
Desperate, Yeskil puts his son on his back and treks 20 kilometers through incredibly harsh, jagged mountain terrain to reach a hospital in the town of Wamena.
It's a brutal journey that would take the better part of a day. Navigating steep ravines, dense jungle, waterfalls, all while carrying a dying child.
They finally reach the hospital, but they are too late. The boy dies that night.
It's just heartbreaking.
It really is. So Yeskil picks up his dead son, puts him back on his shoulders, and carries him those 20 kilometers all the way back home.
And when he arrives, he lays his son down, he walks outside, places his left hand on a rock, and uses a heavy stone to completely smash his own ring finger.
Then he takes a knife, cuts off the shattered joint, and buries the piece of his own hand with his son.
It is an act of self-mutilation that is really jarring to a modern sensibility, but the psychology behind it is profoundly revealing about how we process trauma.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think of the human brain like an electrical circuit. If you push too much voltage through it, the whole house is going to blow unless there is a ground wire.
Right.
For Yeskil, the emotional pain of losing his only son was too much voltage for his brain to process abstractly. Smashing his finger provided a physical, localized ground wire for that agony.
He is using intense physical pain as a pressure valve for an emotional pain that is otherwise unsurvivable.
Exactly. It gives his brain a tangible wound to heal from because, well, you can't put a bandage on a broken heart.
That is a brilliant way to understand the mechanism of his grief. Yeskil amputating his finger serves as a permanent physical tattoo of his loss.
Because in the West, the psychological goal of mourning is often to, move on. We seek closure so we can return to baseline.
But in Papua, they actively refuse to move on. Yeskil amputates his finger so the loss is always present, right there on his hand.
We see the same refusal to separate from the dead in another part of Papua, too, where the author is casually introduced to a 250-year-old smoked mummy.
Oh, Wiamuntuk Mabel.
Yes, this legendary local warrior. They preserved him by draining his body of blood and smoking him over a slow fire for 2 full years.
And it's not treated like a fragile museum exhibit either. The elders simply bring him out of a hut and plop him down on a wooden chopping block so the author can take photos.
He is still an active, physical member of the community.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we see this massive scale of geographical integration in Sulawesi with the Toraja culture.
Oh man, the author is hiking through the jungle, literally having to sneak past a massive territorial water buffalo, which, by the way, sounds terrifying.
Seriously terrifying.
All to find this hidden burial cave. It is 300 to 500 years old.
And inside the cave, a 5-meter-tall wooden scaffolding had collapsed under its own weight over the centuries.
Because it collapsed, there are these beautifully carved wooden coffins called irong, shaped like animals, just spilled everywhere.
Skulls and human bones are just blanketing the cave floor.
But placing the coffins high up on scaffolding in caves isn't neglect, right?
No, it's placing the ancestors directly into the Earth's architecture.
Yeah.
Shaping the irong like animals connects the deceased back to the natural world.
The author was actually so moved by how precarious this history was that he tried to contact Copenhagen University.
He was begging them to send an archaeological team to save the site from natural decay and grave robbers.
Sadly, he never got a reply.
It is tragic that the site might be lost, but it really highlights something beautiful. The physical landscape of Sulawesi is literally built out of their ancestors.
They are hiked up into caves, kept in the roofs of houses in Sumba, or their fingers are buried with their children in Papua.
Death rituals aren't just about mourning. They are the ultimate markers of community boundaries and identity.
Which is exactly what the author encounters in the final leg of his journey, traveling through Namibia and Borneo.
This is where we see how rituals define who belongs to the group and who is an outsider. And the contrast between these next two encounters is just Staggering.
The whiplash is intense. First, he is in Namibia, in a remote place called Puros, spending time with the Himba and Herero people.
He visits a local elder, and they go out to a sandy grave.
And the ritual there is so gentle. You take a bit of the grave sand into your mouth, taste it, and gently blow it out. From dust you came, to dust you shall return.
It is this quiet, beautiful act of humility meant to appease the spirits of the land.
The elder also details other rites of passage that bind their community together, right? Like animus circumcision and the knocking out of front teeth as an initiation rite.
Yeah, and while knocking out teeth sounds extreme, consider how it functions. It permanently alters your smile.
You can never fake being part of the tribe.
Exactly, and you can never hide your membership. It is a lifelong, visible commitment to the group. He also explains how Himba women wash themselves in aromatic smoke instead of water.
Which is a brilliant adaptation, honestly. They are living in an incredibly harsh desert environment. Water is just too precious to use for bathing.
So the smoke acts as an antimicrobial cleanser, allowing them to maintain ritual purity and hygiene while conserving their most vital resource.
Tradition binds the community in perfect harmony with a punishing environment.
A harmony that stands in stark contrast to the author's experience in Borneo. The sheriff there shared an incredibly dark account from 2002 involving a conflict between local indigenous groups and Maduri's migrants.
And we need to pause here and be explicitly clear for you listening. We are not taking sides in the political and ethnic conflicts between the Maduris and the local Borneo populations.
Absolutely not. We are merely reporting the sheriff's account directly from the source material.
Right. But looking at this purely through an anthropological lens, what the local youth did next shows us how ancient rites can be resurrected as weapons.
So the author is in a place called Tumbang Jutu, talking to this local sheriff who is casually walking around in flip-flops.
According to the sheriff, Maduri's migrants had moved into the area and allegedly disrespected the local indigenous customs.
The local youth felt their culture was being erased, and they felt entirely ignored by the central government in Jakarta.
So, feeling cornered and powerless, they revived ancient, forbidden death rituals that had actually been banned by authorities for generations.
Because when a marginalized group feels their identity is threatened and formal political channels fail them, they often reach for the deepest, most foundational markers of their culture.
And in this case, it was a horror movie. We go from this incredibly gentle, beautiful act of tasting the grave sand in Namibia straight into a nightmare in Borneo.
They hunted the migrants through the jungle. They beheaded them and put their heads on spikes right in the middle of the local football field.
They even cut out their hearts. The flip-flop-wearing sheriff admitted his two-man police force was completely powerless to stop the slaughter.
By the time heavily armed backup arrived days later, the youth had simply vanished back into the jungle.
It is horrifying. How does a sacred ancestral ritual mutate into a weapon of war?
Well, rituals at their core dictate who is protected by the ancestors and who is an enemy of the land. Rituals are the ultimate marker of in-group versus out-group.
So when the marginalized youth felt ignored by the government, this was their reaction.
Exactly. Returning to the most terrifying practices of their ancestors wasn't just mindless violence, it was a highly calculated, desperate assertion of power.
It was a way of violently reclaiming their local identity and drawing an absolute terrifying boundary around their community.
The ritual was a broadcast message. We belong to this land and its ancient rules, and you do not.
Wow. It is a chilling reminder of how much weight these traditions carry. Looking back at this entire journey, we've gone from answering phones in the dark at a quiet Washington state funeral home to the bloody charitable streets of Dhaka.
We've explored the desperate physical grief of a father in Papua, the ancient smoked mummies, and the complex, sometimes violent power of ancestral rituals in Borneo.
It really forces a complete reevaluation of our own relationship with mortality.
Because in the West, we spend our entire lives terrified of death. We try to sanitize it, hide it behind wax figure smiles, and push it as far away from our daily lives as possible.
But these journals show us something radically different. Being close to death, touching it, smelling it, keeping it physically present in your home or your village can actually bring a profound sense of community connection.
When death is shared, when it feeds the poor in Dhaka, or when it physically remains in the architecture of the roofs in Sumba, it loses its abstract terror.
It stops being a monster in the dark and just becomes another chapter in the community's ongoing story.
The dead aren't gone. They are just in the next room, resting in the roof, or present in the very soil you taste.
Which brings us directly back to you. Think about your own neighborhood. Imagine if anthropologists stumbled upon your final resting place 500 years from now.
Based on how our modern culture handles death today, what would they assume you valued most?
Would they find an isolated, sterile box, perfectly sealed, that suggests you wanted to be entirely left alone, hidden from the world? Or would they find evidence of a life that was deeply, messily, and permanently intertwined with your community? Something for you to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.